The Alpha King found a girl asleep beside his deadliest wolf, and she didn't fear him. The winter wind carved through the dense forests of northern Montana with a ruthlessness that matched the reputation of the man who ruled these territories. Marcus Thornwood stood at the edge of his estate, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid December air. He was a man built from the harsh realities of survival, broad-shouldered, with scars that told stories his mouth never would, and eyes that held the weight of decisions no one else could bear to make. At 34, he had spent the last decade building an empire from timber, mining rights, and the sheer force of will that came from being born into nothing and refusing to stay there. His people called him the Alpha King, though never to his face. It was a title earned through respect and fear in equal measure. The logging camps, the small towns that depended on his operations, the men who worked his mines, they all understood that Marcus Thornwood's word was law in these mountains. He didn't ask for loyalty. He commanded it through competence and an unwavering commitment to protecting what was his. The compound sprawled across 200 acres of protected wilderness, a fortress of log and stone that spoke to both wealth and isolation. If you're watching this story unfold, take a moment to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from viewers around the world. Marcus had built this place as a sanctuary from the constant demands of his business empire. But tonight, as he made his nightly rounds through the property, he sensed something was different. The air felt charged, the way it does before a storm breaks, and his instincts, honed by years of navigating both boardrooms and backwoods, told him to pay attention. Shadow moved beside him, a massive timber wolf that Marcus had rescued as a dying pup 5 years ago. The animal had grown into something magnificent and terrifying, weighing nearly 200 pounds of muscle and instinct. Most people couldn't look Shadow in the eye without feeling their primal fear activate. The wolf had killed 2 men who'd tried to break into the compound 3 years back, and since then, even Marcus's own security team gave the animal a wide berth. But to Marcus, Shadow was the only living thing he truly trusted, a companion who asked for nothing but food and freedom, and gave loyalty without condition. They walked the perimeter in comfortable silence, Marcus's boots crunching through the fresh snow that had fallen throughout the day. The December cold was brutal this year, with temperatures dropping well below zero most nights. The forecast called for a blizzard to hit within the next 48 hours, and Marcus made a mental note to check that all the emergency generators were fueled and ready. Living this far from civilization meant preparing for the worst and hoping for the best. Shadow suddenly stopped, his ears pinning back against his skull. A low growl rumbled from deep in the wolf's chest, a sound that made Marcus's hand instinctively move to the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. He'd learned to read Shadow's signals over the years, and this wasn't the aggressive posture the wolf took when facing a threat. This was confusion, mixed with something Marcus had never seen in the animal before: curiosity. "What is it, boy?" Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Shadow moved forward, not with the hunting gait Marcus expected, but with an almost cautious approach. They followed a narrow path that led to the old stone den Marcus had built for Shadow near the eastern edge of the property. The wolf spent most nights there when he wasn't patrolling, and Marcus had designed it to be both shelter and fortress, a place where Shadow could feel secure. What Marcus saw when they reached the den made him stop dead in his tracks. A young woman lay curled against Shadow's usual sleeping spot, her small frame barely visible beneath the oversized coat she wore. Her dark hair spread across the stone like spilled ink, and even from several feet away, Marcus could see she was unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with delicate features that seemed impossibly fragile against the harsh environment. Her lips had a bluish tint that spoke of early hypothermia, and her clothes, a thin coat, jeans, and what looked like sneakers rather than proper boots, told Marcus everything he needed to know about how unprepared she'd been for these mountains. Shadow approached the girl slowly, sniffing at her face and hands with an intensity that bordered on protective. Marcus watched, transfixed, as the massive wolf lowered himself beside her. His body heat undoubtedly the only thing keeping her from freezing to death. The animal looked back at Marcus with an expression that seemed almost pleading, as if asking his human companion to help this stranger who'd somehow ended up in his den. "Jesus Christ," Marcus muttered, moving forward carefully. His mind raced through possibilities. Was she a hiker who'd gotten lost? Someone running from something? The nearest hiking trail was 15 miles south, and no one in their right mind would be out here in December without serious cold weather gear. Her presence made no sense, which immediately put Marcus on guard. He knelt beside her, checking for a pulse at her neck. It was there, steady enough, though her skin was far too cold. As his fingers touched her throat, her eyes fluttered open, and Marcus found himself staring into the most striking gray eyes he'd ever seen. For a moment, they were unfocused, confused, but then they locked onto his face with sudden awareness. Most people, when they woke to find a strange man looming over them in the middle of nowhere, would scream or panic. This girl did neither. Her gaze moved from Marcus to Shadow, who was still pressed against her side, and instead of fear, something like wonder crossed her features. "He's beautiful," she whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. Her hand moved, trembling, to rest on Shadow's massive head. The wolf's tail gave a single thump against the stone floor. Marcus sat back on his heels, completely thrown off balance. "You're not afraid." It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway, her eyes never leaving Shadow. "Why would I be afraid? He saved me." "That wolf has killed men," Marcus said flatly, testing her reaction. "He's not a pet. He's dangerous." "So am I," she replied, and despite her weakened state, there was steel in her voice. "But he knew I wasn't a threat. Animals always know." She tried to sit up, and Marcus watched as her face went white with pain. She gasped, clutching her left side, and when she pulled her hand away, Marcus saw blood on her fingers. Her coat was torn there, and what he'd initially missed in the dim light was now obvious. She was injured, and had been for some time. "Don't move," Marcus commanded, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that made men twice his size follow orders without question. "You're hurt, and you're hypothermic. I need to get you inside." "No hospitals," she said immediately, her gray eyes suddenly sharp with something that looked like fear for the first time. "Please. No police. No hospitals. I can't." "I wasn't planning on it," Marcus interrupted. "Nearest hospital is 60 miles away, and we're supposed to get hit with a blizzard. You're coming to the main house. I've got medical supplies there." She studied his face for a long moment, and Marcus had the unsettling feeling that she was reading him the way Shadow read threats in the forest. Instinctively, at a level beyond conscious thought. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she gave a small nod. "Okay. Thank you." Marcus slipped his arms under her carefully, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She was far too light, he realized, the kind of thin that came from weeks of not eating enough. Shadow stood immediately, positioning himself at Marcus's side as they began the walk back to the main house. The wolf kept pace with them, his eyes constantly scanning the darkness, and Marcus found himself wondering at the strange tableau they must make. A man carrying a mysterious stranger, escorted by a wolf that should have torn her apart. "What's your name?" Marcus asked as they walked, his long strides eating up the distance. "Elena," she said softly, her head resting against his chest. "Elena Crawford." "Marcus Thornwood. You're on my property, about 40 miles north of Whitefish. How did you get here?" "I walked." "From where?" She was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might have lost consciousness again, but then she spoke, her voice barely audible above the wind. From anywhere that wasn't where I was before. It was an answer that wasn't an answer. The kind of evasion that usually made Marcus press harder. But something about the exhaustion in her voice, the way she'd said it like a confession, made him hold his questions. There would be time to get the truth later, once she wasn't in danger of dying from exposure and blood loss. The main house loomed ahead, its windows glowing warm against the dark forest. Marcus's housekeeper, Margaret, would have gone home hours ago, leaving him alone as he preferred during the winter months. He carried Elena through the back entrance, Shadow following close behind despite the fact that the wolf usually refused to enter the house. Marcus laid Elena on the leather couch in his study, the room he kept warmest because it housed his most valuable books and documents. Shadow settled on the floor beside the couch, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. Marcus moved quickly, building up the fire in the stone fireplace before grabbing the extensive first aid kit he kept in the supply closet. "I need to see that wound," he said, returning to her side. "Your coat has to come off." Elena nodded, trying to sit up enough to help, but her hands were shaking too badly to manage the zipper. Marcus did it for her, his movements efficient and impersonal despite the intimacy of the action. He'd treated enough injuries over the years, both his own and his men's, to have developed a clinical detachment when it came to medical necessities. The wound was a knife cut, shallow but long, running along her left ribs. It had been crudely bandaged at some point, but the bandage had come loose, allowing the wound to bleed again. The edges were clean enough that Marcus didn't think it needed stitches, but it would need to be properly cleaned and dressed. "This is going to hurt," he warned, opening a bottle of antiseptic. "Everything hurts," Elena said with a weak smile. "What's a little more?" As Marcus cleaned the wound, she gritted her teeth but didn't cry out. He found himself impressed by her pain tolerance. Most people would have been screaming. He worked quickly, applying antibiotic ointment and wrapping her ribs with clean bandages. His hands were surprisingly gentle for their size, and he caught Elena watching his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Who did this to you?" Marcus asked, as he secured the bandage. "Someone who won't be doing it to anyone else," Elena replied, and there was something cold in her voice that made Marcus look up sharply. She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not running from the law, if that's what you're wondering. I'm running from someone who thought he owned me, past tense." Marcus understood what she wasn't saying. He'd grown up in a world where violence was sometimes the only answer to impossible situations, where the law was too slow or too corrupt to help the people who needed it most. He'd killed a man once, years ago, in self-defense, that no court would have questioned, but that had nevertheless changed something fundamental in who he was. He recognized that same change in Elena's eyes. "You're safe here," he said simply. "For as long as you need." Elena's eyes filled with tears that she blinked away quickly. "You don't know me. Why would you help me?" Marcus looked at Shadow, who was still maintaining his vigil beside the couch. "Because he trusts you, and I trust him. That's enough." He helped her into a spare bedroom on the ground floor, one of several guest rooms he maintained despite rarely having guests. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a massive bed covered in thick quilts and a window that looked out over the forest. Marcus showed Elena where the bathroom was, left clean clothes on the bed, sweatpants and a flannel shirt that would be huge on her but warm, and told her to rest. "I'll bring you something to eat in a bit," he said from the doorway. "Think you can manage soup?" "That sounds perfect," Elena said. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking small and lost in the large room. Shadow had followed them and was now lying on the floor beside the bed, clearly having appointed himself her guardian. "Marcus? Thank you. Really?" He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude, and left her to settle in. Back in the kitchen, Marcus heated up beef stew from the batch Margaret had made earlier in the week. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle of Elena Crawford. She'd walked 40 miles through December wilderness, injured and unprepared to escape from someone. She'd somehow ended up in Shadow's den without the wolf attacking her, something Marcus would have said was impossible if he hadn't seen it with his own eyes. And she carried herself with a strange mixture of vulnerability and steel that suggested she was far tougher than she looked. When he brought the food to her room, he found Elena had changed into the clothes he'd left and was sitting up in bed, looking more alert despite her exhaustion. Shadow's head was resting on the edge of the bed, and she was stroking his fur with one hand. The wolf's eyes were half closed in contentment, an expression Marcus had rarely seen on the animal. "How do you do that?" Marcus asked, setting the tray across her lap. "He barely tolerates me touching him." Elena smiled, a real smile this time that transformed her whole face. "I grew up around animals, worked at a wildlife rehabilitation center for 3 years. Animals respond to energy, not words. If you're calm and honest with them, they know it." Most people aren't calm around Shadow. Most people are afraid of their own shadows, Elena said, taking a spoonful of stew. "I've faced worse than a wolf." Marcus pulled up a chair, studying her openly. In the warm light of the bedroom, with color returning to her cheeks and the immediate danger past, he could see that she was striking, rather than conventionally pretty. Sharp cheekbones, a stubborn chin, and those remarkable gray eyes that seemed to see too much. There was a fading bruise on her temple that he hadn't noticed before, and what looked like finger marks on her upper arm. "Tell me what happened," he said. It wasn't a request. Elena was quiet for a moment, eating slowly, clearly organizing her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice was steady but flat, the way people talk when they're recounting trauma they've had to relive too many times. "I was engaged to a man named Derek Hutchins. We lived in Seattle. He was charming, successful, attentive, everything I thought I wanted. Until the first time he hit me, about 6 months into the engagement." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "It got worse after that. He isolated me from my friends, controlled my money, monitored my phone. Classic patterns. I know now. But at the time, he made me believe I deserved it, that I was the problem." She paused, taking a shaky breath. 2 weeks ago, I realized he was planning to kill me. I found life insurance policies he'd taken out on me, documents transferring my assets to him, and I knew that if I didn't leave, I was going to die. "So you ran?" "I tried. He found me at a motel outside Spokane. There was a fight. She stopped, her hand moving unconsciously to her injured side. "I defended myself, with his own knife. I didn't mean to kill him, but I'm not sorry he's dead." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "The police?" "I called 911 after it happened, told them everything. They were sympathetic, said it was clearly self-defense. But Derek's family has money and connections. His father made threats, said he'd make sure I went to prison. I got scared and ran before they could formally charge me. Stupid, I know, but I wasn't thinking clearly." "You've been running for 2 weeks?" "I've been hiding for 2 weeks. I had some cash saved, knew Derek's father would track my credit cards. I stayed in cheap motels, tried to figure out what to do. But 3 days ago, I saw someone I recognized from Derek's company watching one of the places I was staying. I panicked and took off into the mountains. I thought if I could get far enough away, find somewhere remote, I could figure out my next move." She laughed bitterly. "I got lost almost immediately. Used my phone to try to navigate, but the battery died. I've been wandering for 3 days, freezing and bleeding. I honestly thought I was going to die out there. Then I found that den, and it was warm, and I couldn't walk anymore." Marcus stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark forest. The first flakes of the predicted blizzard were beginning to fall, visible in the security lights around the property. He thought about what she'd told him, separating emotion from facts. A woman who'd killed her abuser in self-defense, panicked, and ran from the law, and now was being hunted by a powerful family seeking revenge or justice, depending on your perspective. "You should have stayed," he said finally. "Talk to a lawyer. Running makes you look guilty." "I know that now," Elena said quietly. "But in that moment, all I could think about was Derek's father saying he'd destroy me, and I ran. It was stupid." Marcus turned to face her. "It was human. Fear makes people do irrational things." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I have lawyers, good ones, the kind who don't lose cases. If your story is true, it is. Then you have a solid self-defense case. You don't have to keep running." Elena's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Why would you help me? You don't know if I'm telling the truth." "Shadow knows," Marcus said simply, gesturing to the wolf who was now fully asleep beside her bed. "And I trust his judgment more than most people's. Plus, I've spent my life reading people, Elena. It's how I've survived in business. You're not a liar. You're scared and hurt, and you made a bad decision after a traumatic event. That's not the same as being guilty. What do you get out of this?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Maybe I'm just a good Samaritan." "You don't strike me as the good Samaritan type." "Then maybe I'm curious. Or maybe I know what it's like to feel like the whole world is against you and you have no one to trust." He moved back to the chair. "Get some rest. The blizzard's coming in, which means you're stuck here for at least a few days. We'll talk more in the morning about getting you proper legal representation." Elena nodded, exhaustion clearly winning over her need for answers. "Marcus, I meant what I said before. Thank you. Most people would have just called the police. Most people don't have a wolf making it clear that would be the wrong call," Marcus said, heading for the door. "Sleep. You're safe here. I promise you that." As he left the room, Marcus heard Elena whisper to Shadow, "You're a good judge of character, aren't you, boy?" The wolf's tail thumped against the floor in response. Back in his study, Marcus built up the fire and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. He stood at the window, watching the snow begin to fall in earnest, and thought about the strange turn his evening had taken. He'd built his life on control and predictability, on creating systems that minimized surprises. The appearance of Elena Crawford was the opposite of everything he valued. She was chaos personified, a woman fleeing violence with trouble following close behind. But there had been something in her eyes when she looked at Shadow, when she'd spoken about defending herself, that resonated with something deep in Marcus's own history. He'd been 19 when his father had come after him, drunk and violent for the last time. Marcus had fought back, and his father had fallen, hitting his head on the corner of a table. The old man had survived, but barely, and Marcus had left that night never to return. He'd built his empire from nothing, driven by the need to prove that he was more than the white trash kid from the trailer park, whose father beat him bloody every weekend. He understood what it meant to defend yourself, and then feel like the world had turned against you for having the audacity to survive. The wind howled outside, and Marcus drained his whiskey, feeling the burn all the way down. Tomorrow he'd make calls, start the process of getting Elena proper legal help. He'd use his resources and connections to make sure her case was heard fairly. It was the right thing to do, he told himself, the logical thing. But as he headed to bed, checking one last time on Elena's room where he found both her and Shadow sleeping peacefully, Marcus acknowledged the truth he'd been avoiding. He'd helped her because Shadow trusted her. Yes, but he'd also helped her because when he'd looked into her eyes, he'd seen a reflection of himself. Someone fighting to survive in a world that didn't care whether they lived or died. And maybe, just maybe, he saw a chance to rewrite the ending of a story that looked too much like his own. The blizzard hit in earnest around 3 a.m, the wind screaming around the compound with a fury that made the heavy log walls creak. Marcus woke to the sound and did a quick check of the house, ensuring all the storm shutters were secure. He found himself pausing outside Elena's room, listening for any sign of distress, but heard nothing beyond Shadow's occasional shifting. By dawn, the world outside had transformed into a wall of white. Snow had piled up against the windows, and the thermometer on the back porch read -12 degrees. Marcus started coffee and made a full breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast, figuring Elena would need calories to continue healing. He'd learned long ago that the body needed fuel to repair itself, and she'd been running on empty for too long. Elena appeared around 8, wrapped in one of the spare robes he kept for guests, her dark hair tangled from sleep. Shadow padded beside her, and Marcus noticed that the wolf's entire demeanor had changed. Where he was usually aloof and solitary, he now seemed content to stay near Elena, his body language relaxed in a way Marcus had rarely witnessed. "Good morning," Elena said, her voice still rough with exhaustion. "It smells amazing in here." "Sit," Marcus said, gesturing to the kitchen table. "You need to eat." She obeyed without argument, and Marcus loaded a plate for her while she looked around the kitchen. The room was large and professional grade, designed for someone who actually enjoyed cooking, one of Marcus's few genuine pleasures. Elena seemed surprised by the warmth and sophistication of the space, as though she'd expected something more rustic given the location. "You cook?" she asked as Marcus set the plate in front of her. "I live alone 40 miles from civilization. Learning to cook was either that or starve." He sat across from her with his own breakfast. "How are you feeling?" "Sore, but better. Warmer." She took a bite of eggs and closed her eyes. "God, this is good. I can't remember the last time I had a real meal." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire in the adjoining room and the howl of wind outside. Shadow positioned himself between their chairs, accepting occasional pieces of bacon from both of them. Marcus watched Elena eat with the single-minded focus of someone who'd gone too long without food, and he felt a surge of anger at the man who'd driven her to this state. "The storm's going to last at least 2 days," Marcus said, when Elena had slowed down enough to look less desperate. "Maybe 3. We're completely snowed in. No way out even with the snowmobiles until it passes." Elena nodded, not looking particularly concerned. "That's okay. I have nowhere to be." "About that," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "I made some calls this morning. I have a lawyer, Daniel Chen, who's one of the best criminal defense attorneys in the Pacific Northwest. I briefed him on your situation. In general terms, nothing specific. He says you need to turn yourself in, but with proper representation present. He can arrange it so you surrender voluntarily to police with a self-defense claim already prepared." Elena's face had gone carefully blank. "I don't have money for a lawyer like that." "I do." "Marcus?" "Before you say no," Marcus interrupted, "let me explain something. I don't do things halfway. I don't offer help I'm not prepared to follow through on. Daniel owes me several favors, and he's interested in your case. He thinks it's winnable, especially if we can document Derek's history of abuse." "There won't be much documentation," Elena said bitterly. "I never went to the police, never went to a hospital. I was too ashamed, and Derek was too careful to leave marks where people could see them. There are other ways to build a case. Text messages, emails, testimony from friends or coworkers about changes in your behavior, financial records showing his control. Daniel is good at piecing together circumstantial evidence into a compelling narrative." Marcus paused. "But you have to be willing to fight, Elena. You can't keep running." She was quiet for a long time, staring down at her plate. When she looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "What if they don't believe me? What if his family's money and influence wins? Then I'll make sure they don't," Marcus said simply. "I have money too, and influence. And I'm very good at winning fights, Elena. It's what I do." "Why?" she asked again, more forcefully this time. Why are you doing this? Marcus considered his answer carefully. He could give her the practical reasons, that he believed in justice, that he had resources to spare, that it was the right thing to do. But Elena deserved more than platitudes. When I was 19, he said slowly, my father tried to kill me. He was drunk, which was his usual state, and he came at me with a tire iron. I fought back. He fell and cracked his skull on the kitchen table. He survived, but I left that night and never went back. Marcus met Elena's eyes directly. I spent years wondering if I'd done the right thing, wondering if I should have just taken the beating, if fighting back made me as bad as him. It took me a long time to understand that defending yourself isn't the same as being violent, that survival isn't something to be ashamed of. Elena wiped at her eyes. Did you ever regret it, fighting back? No, but I regret that I spent so long feeling guilty about it. Marcus stood, collecting their plates. You have a chance to do this right, Elena. To stand up and tell your story and let the system work the way it's supposed to. You shouldn't have to spend the rest of your life hiding. And if I do, if I turn myself in and it goes badly, then you'll have the best legal defense money can buy, and you'll have me in your corner making sure every procedural rule is followed and every bit of Derek's history is exposed. Marcus loaded the dishwasher, but running only makes it worse. His family will paint you as a murderer fleeing justice. If you turn yourself in voluntarily with a lawyer, you control the narrative. Elena stood, wrapping the robe tighter around herself. She walked to the large windows that looked out over the snow-covered forest, barely visible through the blowing snow. Shadow followed her, pressing his body against her leg in a gesture of support. I'm scared, she said quietly. That's smart. You should be scared, but you should also be angry. Angry that Derek put you in this position. Angry that his family thinks they can intimidate you into silence. Use that anger. Marcus moved to stand beside her at the window. You're stronger than you think, Elena. You survived Derek. You survived 2 weeks on the run. You survived 3 days in the wilderness in December. You're a fighter. Now you just need to fight in court, instead of in the woods. She turned to look at him, studying his face with that same intense scrutiny she'd used the night before. You really believe I can win? I believe that with the right help, the truth usually comes out, and the truth is on your side. Elena took a deep breath, then nodded. Okay, I'll do it. I'll turn myself in, with your lawyer. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. If this goes wrong, if I end up in prison, I don't want you to feel responsible. This is my choice. Noted, Marcus said. But it won't go wrong. He spoke with a confidence he didn't entirely feel, but Elena seemed to draw strength from it. She spent the rest of the morning resting, reading from Marcus's extensive library, and playing with Shadow. Marcus worked in his office, making calls and sending emails to set the wheels in motion. He spoke with Daniel Chen at length, outlining everything Elena had told him, and arranging for her voluntary surrender once the storm passed. He also made some other calls, to a private investigator he'd used in business dealings, asking for a full background check on Derek Hutchins and his family. Marcus wanted to know exactly who they were dealing with, what resources the family had, and what skeletons might be hiding in their own closets. In his experience, people who wielded power vindictively usually had their own vulnerabilities. By afternoon, the storm had intensified to the point where visibility was zero. Marcus and Elena ended up in the study. She curled up on the couch with a book while he worked on his laptop. Shadow dozed by the fire, occasionally lifting his head to check on them both. It was strangely domestic, this scene, and Marcus found himself oddly comfortable with it. Tell me about this place, Elena said after a while, setting down her book. How did you end up here? Marcus closed his laptop, willing to take a break. I bought the land about 10 years ago, when I was first starting to make real money. I'd grown up in poverty, always surrounded by people, always being watched and judged. I wanted somewhere that was completely mine, where I could be alone when I needed to be. But you're not a hermit. You have a business empire. I have multiple businesses, Marcus corrected. Timber, mining, some real estate development. I spend half my time in cities, in meetings and negotiations. But I need this place to decompress, to remember who I am underneath all the expectations. And who is that? Marcus considered the question. Someone who survives. Someone who protects what's his. Someone who doesn't forget where he came from. That's not an answer, Elena said with a slight smile. Those are roles you play. Maybe the roles are all there is. I don't believe that. Elena shifted to face him more fully. I think people are more than their survival strategies. You saved me, Marcus. You didn't have to. You could have called the police or just ignored me out there, but you brought me in, and you're helping me. And that's not about survival or protection. That's about kindness. Marcus felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny. It's about justice. It's about both, Elena insisted. You have a good heart, even if you try to hide it behind this tough exterior. My heart has nothing to do with it, Marcus said more sharply than he intended. I'm helping you because the situation warrants it. Don't make it into something it's not. Elena looked hurt, but she nodded and returned to her book. The silence that followed was less comfortable than before, and Marcus cursed himself for his harsh response. He wasn't used to people trying to see beneath his carefully constructed walls, and her perceptiveness made him defensive. They had dinner in relative quiet, and Elena retreated to her room early, clearly exhausted. Shadow followed her without hesitation, and Marcus found himself alone in the study, nursing another whiskey and staring into the fire. He'd built his life on emotional distance, on not letting anyone get close enough to become a liability. It had served him well in business, where sentiment was weakness and attachment was a tool for manipulation. But sitting here in the aftermath of his sharp words to Elena, Marcus felt something he rarely allowed himself to experience: regret. She was right that saving her had been about more than justice. He could have helped her anonymously, could have just called in favors without getting personally involved. But something about Elena had gotten under his skin, had awakened a protective instinct he usually reserved for his business interests. Maybe it was her eyes, or the way she'd looked at Shadow without fear. Maybe it was the recognition of shared trauma. Or maybe, Marcus admitted to himself, he was just lonely. He fell asleep in the chair by the fire, and woke around midnight to find a blanket draped over him. Elena stood near the door, preparing to leave, and when she saw his eyes open, she gave him a sad smile. I was wrong to push, she said quietly. You've done more for me than anyone has in years. I don't have the right to ask for more than that. Marcus stood, the blanket falling away. Elena, it's okay, really. Get some sleep, Marcus. Thank you for everything. She left before he could respond, Shadow padding after her. Marcus stood there alone in his study, surrounded by his books and his fire and his whiskey, and felt the full weight of his isolation. He'd spent so long building walls that he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. And now that someone was trying, he was pushing her away out of pure instinct. He didn't sleep well that night, and when morning came, he found Elena already awake in the kitchen, making coffee. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystalline world of white. The sky was clear, brilliant blue, and the temperature had risen slightly to an almost manageable 0 degrees. Good morning, Elena said, her tone neutral but not cold. Coffee? Please. Marcus accepted the mug she handed him. Elena, about last night. You don't have to apologize, she interrupted gently. I overstepped. You're helping me out of kindness, and I was reading things into it that aren't there. It won't happen again. That's not what I was going to say. Marcus set down his mug. You were right. About most of it. I do hide behind roles. I do keep people at arm's length. It's how I've survived, how I've built what I have. But you weren't wrong about the kindness either. I am helping you because I think you deserve it. Because I recognize something in you that I see in myself. And because... He paused, forcing himself to be honest. Because I like having you here. You and Shadow both. This house has been empty for a long time, and having you here makes it feel less like a fortress and more like a home. Elena's eyes widened slightly. Marcus, I'm not good at this, he continued, the words coming faster now. At being open. At letting people see who I really am instead of who I've made myself into. But you asked me who I am underneath the roles. And the truth is, I don't know anymore. Maybe the roles are all there is. But when I'm around you, I feel like maybe there could be something more. The silence that followed was heavy with possibility. Elena stepped closer, her gray eyes searching his face for something. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. Thank you for telling me that. It means more than you know. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cold despite the warm house. I see you, Marcus. Not the Alpha King, not the business tycoon. I see a man who rescued a dying wolf pup and gave it a home. I see a man who brought a stranger in from the cold instead of leaving her to die. I see someone who understands what it means to survive and is still trying to figure out how to live. Marcus looked down at their joined hands, feeling something shift inside him. He'd spent so long being self-sufficient, needing no one, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by another person. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The storm's passed, he said after a moment. We should be able to get the roads cleared by tomorrow. Daniel wants to meet with you. Go over your statement before you turn yourself in. Okay, Elena said, not letting go of his hand. I'm ready, thanks to you. They spent that day in quiet companionship, the tension from the previous night replaced by something gentler, but no less significant. Marcus showed Elena around the compound, explaining the various buildings and their purposes. She was particularly fascinated by Shadow's den, where she'd first been found. He really would have killed me, wouldn't he? Elena asked, looking at the massive structure. If he'd wanted to. Without question, Marcus confirmed. I've seen him take down a full-grown elk. He's not tame, Elena. He's just... selective. Like someone else I know, Elena said with a knowing smile. By evening, Marcus's private investigator had sent over a preliminary report on Derek Hutchins and his family. Marcus read through it while Elena prepared dinner. She'd insisted on cooking to earn her keep, despite Marcus's protests. What he found in the report made his blood run cold. Derek Hutchins had been investigated twice for domestic violence by different women before Elena. Both cases had been dropped after the Hutchins family applied pressure, including threats and financial settlements. One of the women had disappeared entirely, and the investigator noted that her whereabouts remained unknown. Marcus also found something else. Derek's father, Thomas Hutchins, had connections to several judges and prosecutors in the Seattle area through both business dealings and political donations. It explained why Elena had been so afraid of the legal system failing her. What's wrong? Elena asked, coming into the study with plates of food. She'd seen his expression and set the plates down on his desk. Marcus turned his laptop so she could see. Derek had a history. Multiple complaints, all buried by his family's money. And his father has the kind of connections that make fair trials difficult. Elena sank into the chair across from him, her face going pale as she read. I knew he'd done it before. He told me once when he was drunk that I wasn't the first woman who'd needed to be taught a lesson. I didn't want to believe him. This changes things, Marcus said. We have pattern evidence. We have proof that the Hutchins family has interfered with justice before. Daniel can use this. They'll come after me harder, Elena said quietly. If I expose all this, they'll want to destroy me completely. They'll try, Marcus agreed, but they'll have to go through me first. And I don't lose, Elena, not when it matters. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. They ate dinner together, discussing strategy and timeline. Marcus made more calls, this time to contacts in the media. He wanted this story out there, wanted public pressure on the Hutchins family before they could quietly crush Elena in court. By the time they finished, Marcus had lined up 2 investigative reporters who were interested in covering the case, pending Elena's approval. That night, Elena came to Marcus's study where he was working late. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in the robe again, looking uncertain. I couldn't sleep, she said. I keep thinking about going back, facing all of this. I'm trying to be brave, but... Come here, Marcus said, standing up. Elena crossed the room, and without thinking, Marcus pulled her into his arms. She was small against his chest, trembling slightly, and he felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. You don't have to be brave all the time. You're allowed to be scared. I don't want to be weak, Elena said against his chest. Being scared isn't weak, it's honest. Marcus rested his chin on top of her head. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Elena. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. You've shown more courage in the last 2 weeks than most people show in a lifetime. They stood like that for a long time, drawing comfort from each other's presence. Shadow appeared in the doorway, watching them with what Marcus could have sworn was approval. When Elena finally pulled back, her eyes were clearer, stronger. I'm glad I found your wolf's den, she said softly. I'm glad Shadow trusted me. I'm glad you brought me in. So am I, Marcus said, and meant it. The next morning, the road crew that Marcus employed to maintain his private access road arrived and began clearing the snow. By afternoon, the path to civilization was passable, and Daniel Chen called to arrange a meeting for the following day in Whitefish. The plan was set. Elena would turn herself in at the police station with Daniel present, give a full statement, and let the legal process begin. Marcus spent that evening going over every detail with Elena, preparing her for what to expect. Daniel had warned them that she'd likely be arrested and arraigned, possibly held overnight until bail could be arranged. Marcus had already prepared to post whatever bail was required, though Daniel thought it likely she'd be released on her own recognizance, given that she was turning herself in voluntarily. What if they don't give me bail? Elena asked, her voice small. Then I'll make sure you have the best accommodations possible while we wait for trial, Marcus said firmly. And I'll visit every day they allow it. You won't be alone in this, Elena. Why are you so committed to this? Elena asked. To me? Marcus had been asking himself the same question, and he'd finally found an answer he could articulate. Because you remind me that there's more to life than building empires and keeping everyone at arm's length. Because Shadow chose you, and he's never been wrong about people. And because... He paused, then decided to just say it. Because in the few days I've known you, you've made me feel less alone than I have in years. I want to help you not just because it's right, but because I want to see who you become when you're not running anymore. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I want to see who you become when you're not hiding anymore. Fair point, Marcus said with a slight smile. That night, their last night before facing the world again, they sat together in the study while Shadow dozed by the fire. Marcus told Elena about building his business, about the struggles and victories. Elena told him about her life before Derek, about working with animals and dreaming of running her own wildlife rehabilitation center someday. When this is over, Marcus said, when you're cleared and free to live your life again, what will you do? Elena thought about it. I want to start over somewhere new, somewhere I can make a difference. Maybe I'll finally open that rehabilitation center, work with animals who've been hurt and help them heal. She looked at Marcus. What about you? What do you want? Marcus had spent so long focused on expansion and acquisition that he'd forgotten to think about what he actually wanted. But looking at Elena, at the woman who'd somehow become important to him in just a few days, he found he had an answer. I want to stop being alone, he said simply. I want to let people in, starting with you and Shadow. That sounds like a good plan, Elena said softly. They stayed up late into the night, talking about everything and nothing, building a foundation of understanding that went beyond the crisis that had brought them together. When Elena finally went to bed, she paused in the doorway and looked back at Marcus. Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for giving me back my courage. Thank you for reminding me why courage matters, Marcus replied. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Marcus helped Elena prepare for the meeting with Daniel, lending her proper winter clothes and boots that actually fit. She looked stronger now than she had when he'd found her, the color back in her cheeks and the determination restored to her eyes. They made the drive to Whitefish in Marcus's truck, Shadow riding in the back seat and refusing to be left behind. Daniel Chen met them at his office, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s with kind eyes and a reputation for never giving up on his clients. He spent 3 hours going over Elena's statement, asking difficult questions and helping her articulate her experiences in a way that would be compelling in court. You have a strong case, Daniel told her when they finished, especially with the evidence of Derek's history. But you need to be prepared for this to get ugly. The Hutchins family will try to paint you as a gold digger who killed Derek for his money. They'll dig into your past, try to find anything they can use against you. Let them dig, Elena said firmly. I have nothing to hide. They went to the police station together, Marcus and Shadow waiting outside while Daniel accompanied Elena inside. Marcus paced the parking lot, his phone in hand, ready to make calls if anything went wrong. An hour passed, then 2. Marcus was considering barging in when Daniel emerged. She's been arrested as expected, Daniel explained. But the arraignment is tomorrow morning, and I'm confident she'll be released on her own recognizance. The prosecutor I spoke with seemed sympathetic, especially once I outlined Derek's history. Can I see her? Not until after the arraignment, but she wanted me to tell you that she's okay, and to take care of Shadow. Marcus nodded, a tightness in his chest that he didn't want to examine too closely. He drove back to the compound with Shadow, the wolf whining intermittently and clearly confused by Elena's absence. Marcus found himself talking to the animal, explaining what was happening, and wondering when he'd become the kind of person who had full conversations with a wolf. That night was the longest of Marcus's life. The house felt empty despite Shadow's presence, and Marcus found himself constantly checking his phone for updates. Daniel called around midnight with good news. The local news had picked up the story, and the reporter had found one of Derek's previous victims who was willing to go on record. Public opinion was starting to shift in Elena's favor. The arraignment the next morning was brief. Marcus sat in the back of the courtroom, watching as Elena stood before the judge with Daniel at her side. She looked small, but unbroken, her voice steady as she entered her plea of not guilty by reason of self-defense. The prosecutor, clearly aware of the media attention, didn't object to her release on her own recognizance. The judge set a preliminary hearing date for 3 weeks out and released Elena to await trial. Marcus met her outside the courthouse, and Elena practically ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. He held her tight, feeling the trembling in her body and the tears soaking into his shirt. It's okay, he murmured into her hair. You did great. It's going to be okay. I was so scared, Elena said. But I kept thinking about what you said, that being scared doesn't mean being weak. So I just kept going. They drove back to the compound together, and when they arrived, Shadow went wild with joy, practically bowling Elena over in his excitement. Marcus stood back and watched them, this woman and this wolf who had somehow become the most important things in his carefully controlled life. Over the next 3 weeks, as they prepared for the preliminary hearing, Marcus watched Elena transform. She was no longer running or hiding. She met with Daniel daily, working on her testimony and preparing for cross-examination. She gave interviews to the reporters Marcus had connected her with, telling her story with brutal honesty. And slowly, public opinion solidified in her support. The Hutchins family tried to push back, issuing statements calling Elena a murderer and demanding justice for their son. But with each statement, more information about Derek's history came out. 2 more women came forward with stories of abuse. Evidence emerged of the family's pattern of covering up their son's violence. By the time the preliminary hearing arrived, the narrative had shifted completely. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic. The prosecutor, facing overwhelming evidence of self-defense and a hostile public opinion, offered a deal. The charges would be dropped entirely if Elena agreed to testify as a witness in a civil case the other victims were bringing against the Hutchins family. Daniel advised accepting, and Elena agreed without hesitation. When the judge dismissed the charges, Elena turned to Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she said, her voice breaking. "It's really over." Marcus pulled her close, not caring who saw. "You're free." They celebrated that night at the compound, just the 3 of them, Marcus, Elena, and Shadow. Marcus cooked an elaborate meal while Elena danced around the kitchen, giddy with relief and liberation. They drank wine and talked about the future, about all the possibilities that were now open to Elena. "I've been thinking," Elena said as they sat by the fire after dinner, "about what to do next. And I want to stay here. Not permanently," she added quickly. "I know you value your privacy, and I need to rebuild my own life. But for a while, if you'll let me, there's something about this place, about these mountains, that makes me feel like I can breathe again." Marcus felt something warm expand in his chest. "Stay as long as you want. The house is big enough for both of us to have space when we need it." "Are you sure? I don't want to impose—" "Elena," Marcus interrupted gently. "I haven't felt this alive in years. You being here doesn't impose on my space. You've opened it up, made it feel like something other than a fortress. Stay. Please." Elena smiled, the kind of smile that lit up her entire face. "Okay, I'll stay." And she did. Over the following months, Elena settled into life at the compound. She started working remotely for a wildlife conservation organization, using Marcus's extensive library and internet connection to coordinate rescue efforts across the region. Marcus found himself adjusting his schedule to be home more, drawn by the warmth Elena brought to the house and the conversations that stretched late into the night. They developed routines, morning coffee together while watching the sun rise over the mountains, evening walks through the forest with Shadow, cooking together in the large kitchen. It was domestic in a way Marcus had never experienced, and he found himself craving it more with each passing day. One evening, about 6 months after Elena's charges were dropped, they were sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. Shadow lay at their feet, contentedly chewing on a bone. Elena turned to Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "I've been offered a job," she said quietly. "Director of a wildlife rehabilitation center in Wyoming. It's everything I've ever wanted professionally." Marcus felt his heart sink, though he kept his expression neutral. "That's amazing. You should take it." "Should I?" Elena asked, her gray eyes searching his face. "Because I'm not sure I want to." "Why not?" "Because everything I want is right here." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "I love this place. I love the work I'm doing from here. I love Shadow. And I love—" She paused, then continued with quiet certainty. "I love you, Marcus. I have for months now. And I don't want to leave." Marcus stared at her, his mind racing. He'd felt it too, this growing connection between them. But he'd been afraid to name it. Afraid that if he acknowledged what he felt, she'd leave, and he'd be alone again. But here she was, offering him everything he'd been too scared to ask for. "I love you too," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "I have since that first night when you looked at Shadow without fear. When you saw through all my defenses like they weren't even there. I love you, Elena, and I want you to stay. Not as a guest, but as your partner," Elena finished. "As someone who belongs here with you." "Yes," Marcus said simply. Elena kissed him then, soft and sure, and Marcus felt the last of his carefully unraveling, all the tight knots of control and isolation loosening at once. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to stop bracing for impact and simply exist in a moment that felt unreservedly right. Shadow huffed from his place at their feet, as if announcing his approval. Elena laughed against Marcus's lips and pulled back just enough to look at the wolf. "You did this, you know," she told him. "You brought me to him." Marcus huffed a quiet laugh, careful. His ego's big enough already. "Sounds familiar," Elena teased, and there was no sting in it, only warmth. Life did not transform overnight into a fairy tale. The outside world didn't care that a woman who'd survived abuse and a man who'd built an empire from nothing had found each other on a frozen mountain. There were still business crises for Marcus to handle. An equipment failure at one of the mines, a land dispute with a neighboring property owner, a labor contract that required delicate negotiation. There were still intrusive journalists trying to turn Elena into a symbol, a face of survival, when all she wanted was to work and live quietly. But something fundamental had shifted. The house that had once been a fortress now hummed with a different kind of energy. Elena's laughter echoed through the halls. There were boots by the back door that weren't Marcus's, and coffee mugs left half-finished near the stack of books Elena was always working through. Shadow split his time between Marcus's office and the small room Elena had turned into a makeshift wildlife coordination hub, trotting back and forth as though unwilling to choose between them. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the Montana wilderness. The snow receded from the lower slopes, revealing damp earth and last autumn's flattened grasses. Streams broke free of their icy prisons, running fast and cold through the forest. With the thaw came a new rhythm, one that had less to do with survival and more to do with building something that might actually last. One morning in late March, Marcus woke before dawn out of habit. The sky outside the window was a deep indigo, the first hint of light touching the jagged line of the mountains. Elena was asleep beside him, her dark hair a spill of shadow across the pillow. Her face relaxed in a way it had never been when he'd first found her. Shadow lay across the doorway, a living barrier between them and the world. Marcus watched them both for a long time, feeling a quiet contentment he almost didn't recognize. He had spent so many years measuring his worth in numbers, profit margins, acreage acquired, contracts signed. But there was no metric for this feeling, no spreadsheet that could capture the simple rightness of waking up with people, human and otherwise, he loved within reach. He'd never used the word love easily. It had been poisoned in his childhood, wielded as a manipulative tool by a father who apologized with the same breath he used to threaten. But with Elena, the word felt different, solid, earned. Not a promise but a practice, something they chose every day in small and large ways. Around mid-morning, while Marcus was on a conference call with his operations managers, Elena appeared in the doorway of his office with an excited energy he recognized immediately. She held a printed email in her hand, the pages shaken slightly by the force of her enthusiasm. "When you're done playing Mountain Tyrant, I need you," she said, trying and failing to keep a straight face. "I'm negotiating safety protocols, not conquest," Marcus replied, covering the phone's mic with his hand. "Give me 10. She gave him exactly 9.5, if the impatient tapping of her foot in the hall was any indication. Marcus wrapped up the call with his usual efficiency, issued marching orders, then turned his full attention to Elena. "All right. Show me what has you vibrating like Shadow when he hears the word elk." She thrust the email at him. It was from a conservation organization he'd never heard of, based in Wyoming but with national reach. As he read, several key phrases jumped out at him: joint initiative, seed funding, remote rehabilitation campus, pilot program for survivors of domestic violence to work with injured wildlife. "They want me to design it," Elena said, unable to contain herself. "This entire program. They read the profile that came out after the case, the one about my work with animals before Derek, and how I rebuilt my life here. They want to create a center that combines wildlife rehab with therapeutic work for abuse survivors, and they want to do it here, in Montana, on land we would acquire together, but with you as primary investor and landowner." Marcus read the email twice, then a third time, mind clicking through logistics even as his chest warmed with something more personal. The idea was brilliant. It intersected with several things he already cared about: responsible land use, local employment, meaningful philanthropy that wasn't just writing checks and walking away. "They'd want to partner with your operations," Elena continued. "Use your existing infrastructure for access and supplies, hire locals for construction and maintenance. They want to build something permanent, not just a feel-good project." It was, Marcus realized, exactly the kind of endeavor he'd been unconsciously looking for without knowing it. Something that gave his resources a purpose beyond accumulation. Something that tied his name to more than extraction and profit. "What do you want?" he asked, because that was always the first question, and the most important. Elena didn't hesitate. "I want this. I want to build a place where beings who have been hurt, animals and people, can come and heal. I want to use what I went through for something other than nightmares." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we do it." Elena blinked. "Just like that?" "Not just like that," Marcus said. "There will be land surveys, environmental impact studies, negotiations with the county. We'll need permits, architectural plans, contracts. It will be a lot." His mouth quirked. "But the answer is yes. We do it." She crossed the room in 2 strides and wrapped her arms around his neck. "This will change people's lives, Marcus, the way you changed mine." "You changed your own life," he corrected quietly, holding her. "I just opened a door. You walked through." "Semantics," she murmured against his chest. "We make a good team." They did. Over the next year, the plan took shape. Marcus acquired a valley 3 ridges over from the main compound, a place with a year-round stream, natural meadows, and enough forest cover to shelter recovering wildlife. He negotiated with the county and state agencies, sometimes leveraging his reputation, sometimes deliberately setting it aside and letting Elena and the conservation group take the lead so the project wouldn't be seen as just another Thornwood expansion. Elena threw herself into the work with a passion Marcus found both inspiring and slightly alarming. She designed habitats tailored to different species: raptors, small mammals, larger ungulates, always with an eye toward eventual release. She worked with trauma counselors to create a program where survivors of abuse could volunteer, learning to care for injured animals as a way of reconnecting with their own instincts and boundaries. "This isn't about turning them into saints," she told Marcus one evening as they reviewed a draft brochure. "It's about giving them a place where their hypervigilance and empathy actually make sense. Where they can look at a creature that survived something terrible and think, if you can heal, maybe I can too." "You talk like someone who's been there," Marcus said, though he already knew the answer. "I have been there." She looked at him steadily. "And so have you, in your own way. That's why this matters." Funding was never an issue. Marcus committed to covering any shortfall, and several unexpected donors came forward after word of the project spread. One was a woman who'd once dated Derek Hutchins and gotten out early, before the worst of his behavior emerged. She sent a handwritten note with her contribution, thanking Elena for ensuring his legacy won't be just pain, Another was a retired judge who'd seen too many cases like Elena's and wanted to support something that addressed the aftermath rather than just the crime. Construction began in late summer. Elena insisted on being on site as much as possible. Hard hat perched atop her dark hair, boots caked in mud. She learned to read blueprints, negotiated with contractors, and wasn't above picking up a shovel herself when a trench needed digging. Shadow became a fixture at the site. Shadowing, the irony wasn't lost on anyone, the crews and occasionally stealing unattended sandwiches. Marcus divided his time between the new center, his existing operations, and the compound. He found himself delegating more than he ever had before, trusting his managers to handle daily crises while he invested his energy in something that felt like legacy instead of just expansion. He and Elena argued sometimes, about details mostly. She wanted to prioritize certain habitats over others. He worried about budget overruns and long-term sustainability. But the arguments always came back to the same place: mutual respect, shared goals, and the understanding that they were on the same side. One evening, after a particularly heated disagreement over whether to install an expensive but more wildlife-friendly fencing system, they found themselves standing in the half-finished raptor enclosure as the sun set behind the mountains. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and disturbed earth. "You know I'm only pushing because I want this to last," Marcus said, hands on his hips. "We can't save every animal, Elena." "I know," she said, still bristling but calmer. "But for the ones we do save, I want to do it right. Not just good enough. This place is supposed to be different." "It will be," Marcus said, "because you're building it. Because we're building it." Elena exhaled, some of the fight leaving her shoulders. "You really believe that?" "I do, and not just because you wear me down in these arguments." A reluctant smile tugged at her mouth. "We can do the cheaper fencing on the outer perimeter," she conceded. "But the main enclosures need to be the safer material. I'm not compromising on that." "Done," Marcus said immediately, having already decided the same thing an hour earlier. "I just wanted you to get there on your own." She swatted his arm. "Manipulative. Strategic," he corrected. "Alpha King," she teased. But there was affection in it now. Not the wary irony he'd once heard in people's voices when they used that nickname. The center opened 2 years after the night Marcus found Elena in Shadow's den. The ceremony was simple by design. No ribbon-cutting politicians, no stage photo ops with carefully curated donors. Just the staff they'd hired, a handful of local community members, a few survivors who had volunteered to be part of the pilot program, and some very confused but photogenic rehab animals in their temporary enclosures. If you're still here with us watching this story unfold, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these mountains reach through your screens. Now back to the heart of it. Elena stood at the center of the gathered group, wearing jeans, worn-in boots, and a clean but paint-splattered work shirt. Shadow sat at her side, a living testament to what could grow from broken beginnings. Marcus stood a little behind her, not because he didn't belong at the front, but because this was her moment more than his. "I used to think survival was the end goal," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly without a microphone. The valley amplified sound in a way that made technology almost unnecessary. "Get through the day, get away, get out, survive." And when I did, when I walked away from something that was supposed to kill me, I thought that was it. I thought survival was the finish line. She paused, looking around at the enclosures, the surrounding forest, the small cluster of people who had become part of this place. "But survival is the beginning," she continued. "It's the moment you realize you have a future again, and then you have to decide what to do with it." For a long time, I didn't know. I was lost, physically, emotionally. And then I stumbled into a den in the middle of a Montana blizzard, lay down next to a creature that could have torn me apart, and closed my eyes because I was too exhausted to be afraid anymore. Soft laughter rippled through the group, but more than one person wiped at their eyes. "That wolf didn't kill me," Elena said, resting a hand on Shadow's head. "He kept me warm until someone came who could help, someone who'd fought his own battles and built his own refuge, and who chose to open his doors instead of closing them." She turned, meeting Marcus's eyes for a moment, and the unspoken words between them felt almost tangible. "This center exists because of that choice," she said, turning back to the crowd. "Because sometimes the difference between dying in the snow and building a new life is one person, or one wolf, who decides you're worth saving. We built this place for all the beings who have been hurt and are still deciding whether they get to have a future. For the animals who had no choice, and for the people who thought they had no choices left." Elena's gaze found the small cluster of survivors standing together, the first group of participants in the human side of the program. They varied in age, race, background, but they all carried a similar wary alertness in their posture. "If you're here as part of that program," she said gently, "I want you to know something. No one here expects you to be grateful, or healed, or inspirational. You don't have to be anything other than exactly as you are right now. Tired, angry, numb, confused. All of that is welcome here. You get to sit with an injured hawk or a frightened fawn and say nothing at all, or say everything. This is a place where survival is honored, not questioned. Where healing is a process, not a performance." She took a breath, her voice roughening slightly. "This place exists because one night I stopped being able to pretend I was okay, and someone met me in that truth instead of walking away from it. Our promise to every animal and every person who comes through these gates is simple. We will not walk away from your truth, whatever shape it takes." When the small crowd applauded, it wasn't the polite sound of people recognizing a well-phrased speech. It was something deeper, a collective exhale from people who recognized themselves in her words. Marcus watched her with a complicated mix of pride, love, and a faint ache in his chest. He had spent his life believing that strength meant self-containment, that vulnerability was a liability. Yet here was Elena, standing in front of strangers and bearing the most painful parts of her story, and he had never seen anything more powerful. After the speeches and the quiet tours, after the first group of volunteers had been shown where they'd be working, and the last vehicle had driven back down the new access road, Marcus and Elena walked the perimeter of the property together. Shadow ranged ahead, occasionally circling back to nudge one of them, as if herding them along their own boundary. "You were incredible," Marcus said, not bothering to temper the admiration in his voice. "I didn't throw up," Elena said, "so I consider it a win." He smiled. "You didn't look nervous." "I was terrified." She glanced at him. "But I kept thinking about what you said that first week, about courage not being the absence of fear. Figured I should practice what I preach." They stopped at the edge of a small rise that overlooked the central meadow. From here, the layout of the center was clearly visible. The gently curving paths, the clusters of enclosures designed to blend into the landscape rather than dominate it. The modest main building that housed the clinic and counseling rooms. "You did this," Marcus said quietly. "I helped. I funded. But you created this." "We did this," Elena corrected. "Shadow included. He's the original recruitment officer." Shadow snorted, then flopped down at their feet as if claiming the acknowledgement. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the chorus of birds, the distant rush of water, the subtle sounds of animals moving in their new spaces. The air was cool, but not cold, the sky a high, impossible blue. "Do you ever miss who you were before?" Elena asked suddenly. "Before the business? Before all of this?" Marcus considered the question. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of having nothing to lose," he admitted. "When you're at the bottom, the stakes are weirdly low. You fight because it's all you know. But I don't miss being that angry, that alone. Having something to lose means having something worth protecting." I think I'd rather live here in the risk than go back to feeling like my only job was to survive. Elena nodded slowly. I feel that. There are days I miss the numbness, the way it made everything quieter. But then I think about the alternative, feeling this much and not having anywhere to put it. No animals, no people, no work that matters. I think the feelings are worth it if they come with all of this. With all of this, Marcus echoed, and he wasn't just talking about the center. They headed back toward the main building hand in hand, moving in easy sync like people who'd had time to learn each other's natural pace and adjust without thinking. There would still be challenges ahead. Funding cycles, staff turnover, difficult cases where animals didn't make it, and survivors relapsed or disappeared. There would be bad days and fights, and moments when both of them wanted to burn everything down and retreat to their old, familiar armor. But there would also be mornings when Elena woke to the sound of a rehabilitated hawk being released and felt her chest swell with a kind of joy that made the dark years feel distant. There would be evenings when Marcus closed his laptop, walked out onto the porch of the main house, and saw the lights of the center glowing like a small constellation in the valley. A visible proof that his power could be used for something other than acquisition. There would be countless walks with Shadow along the ridgelines, the three of them moving through the changing seasons like a small, unlikely pack that had chosen one another against all odds. Years later, when journalists occasionally came knocking again, this time wanting to profile the Thornwood Crawford Rehabilitation Center as a model of integrated healing, Marcus and Elena would take turns deciding who felt like talking and who would handle the animals that day. They never romanticized their origin story, never turned it into a tidy narrative about fate or destiny. When people asked how it all began, Elena always started the same way. I was running. He was patrolling. The wolf found me first. And Marcus, if he was there, would add, she wasn't afraid of him. That's when I knew she belonged here. Because beneath all the logistics and legal battles, beneath the construction projects and the carefully planned therapy programs, that was the simple, unvarnished truth. On a night when a storm was coming and survival seemed like a losing bet, a girl lay down beside a creature everyone else feared, and neither of them chose violence. In that quiet, improbable truce, something new started. Not magic, not miracle. Just 3 living beings, 2 human, 1 wolf, deciding that trust was a risk worth taking. From that choice grew a life, and then a home, and finally a sanctuary where others could come to make their own choices, to stop just surviving and start, however tentatively, to live.